Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Revelation. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. We're going to continue in our study in chapter 20. And we started with verse 11 saying, and it says, I saw a great white throne. So we said, this judgment is the one. I also may note that, remember, there were two judgments. There was a first resurrection. This is the second resurrection. And so if you're in the first resurrection, which means those who have obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, let me just say that that is the only difference between those who appear between the two judgments. The judgment seat of Christ is the bema seat. The great white throne is judgment, those who have rejected Jesus Christ. And so the only difference is that, excuse me, the only difference is one who have obeyed the gospel. And the biggest question, the biggest mystery is, why would people not accept the gospel? Why? Why do they harden their hearts? That's a great mystery. And by the way, the Bible doesn't answer that either. We see that in this 20th chapter, people who even lives with Jesus. One of the biggest arguments that atheists would make and agnostics would make is that, well, if Jesus comes, why won't he come and save people? Why don't he come and physically be here? He does. And notice they still rebel. That's sin nature. The bigger question is, why do people choose to reject God? All right, so in this great white throne judgment, we said, it's different than the other thrones that we saw in the book of Revelations. The fourth chapter, the throne was one of worship, love, grace, redemption. We're crying out, oh, great and wonderful is the great King, the great God, the Creator. Here, this is now you're standing and tremble. So verse 11, again, he says, then I saw a great white throne, and the one seated on it, earth and heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found in them. I also saw the dead, the great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open. Another book was open, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works by what was written in the book. Now look at some clarity when he says that the dead was judged according to their works. Either judgment, whether it's the judgment seat of Christ or the judgment, this great white throne judgment, neither one of these judgments is to determine if you're saved or not. Neither judgment is to determine if you're going to make it into heaven. When he says, I saw the dead, there are two applications. Remember, we talked spiritual death. When Adam ate the fruit, he spiritually died. That's when the sin nature entered humanity. The curse came in through Adam. And so every human that was born from Adam from that time on was born dead or spiritually dead. And that spiritual death, remember, is to be alienated from the life of God, to be cut off from the life of God. That's what the spiritual death is concerned. So when he's talking about the dead here, he's not only talking about those who have died, but those who have died alienated from the life of God. Why? Because remember, he just told us in chapter 20, verses, verse 4, is it? Verse 5. Now listen, he says, the rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were complete. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and the Messiah and will reign with him 1,000 years. So when he talks about the dead here, down in verse 12, the dead are those who die alienated from the life of God. They are alienated from the life of God because they refuse to obey the gospel. So now they're going to be judged. So this is not to determine, well, this is not a second hearing or appeal, anything like that. Their doom is set. They have rejected God, and now they're going to be judged. And notice he says they're going to be judged according to their works. So he mentions the book of life. The books were open. Another books were open to the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works. And it's interesting, we see this book, and by the way, let me just show you a couple of verses. The book of life is not something, excuse me, the book of life is not something, when we're talking about the books, this is not some new concept. We can go all the way back to the Old Testament. I'm going to do that. Moses mentions this, and I'm going to just show you in Exodus, the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 32. Israel had sinned with the golden calf. And as a result, God was tempted to judge them. And Moses interceded and said, spare them. But notice this is what Moses says in verse 33. Now, again, this is after they have sinned. And Moses would then go and tell them, you guys really sinned a big sin here. Because one of the things they did, they created this golden calf, and they said that this calf is what delivered them from Egypt. This calf did all the miracles, and then there was this big drunken orgy. In other words, the scene when Moses came down, there was this huge, the thousands of people engaged in all kinds of sexual perversity because pagan worship, most pagan worship, by the way, have some type of pagan sexual perversity to it. And that's what Moses saw. And then they were doing this saying, this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. So verse 33, the Lord replied to Moses, whoever has sinned, no, verse 32, I'm going to go back to 32. He says, now, if you will not forgive their sin, but if not, please erase me from the book that you have written. So my point is, he mentions this book, verse 33, the Lord replied to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will erase from my book. Now, I also want to stop because there's always some questions about what the book is, right? It's a book of life. And the other issue is, when the names of the book of life are written in the book of life, can a name be taken out? Now notice God says here that those who have sinned will be taken out of the book of life. In other words, you start off with some names, and he says here, those who have sinned, I'm going to erase out. We don't have a lot of information about the book of life. We don't have a lot of information about these books. I just wanted to kind of show you that even back as far as Moses, the idea of this book and also a record. So a lot of times we think people are getting away with something. We think, and we oftentimes, I know we probably all have said this. This person seems like they're getting away with it. They've lived 100 years and they have been nothing but evil. Well, the book of life, this is the ultimate in reckoning here. And that is God has recorded every thought, every intent. In fact, the Bible tells us over and over again that every intent of heart will be revealed in this day. Revelation chapter 17, one more reference about these books. And notice he said God is going to judge then out of this book, these books. People are going to say, well, God, I didn't know. Verse 8 says, the beast that you saw and is not is about to come up from the abyss and go into destruction. Those who live on the earth, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast. Okay, I'm going to stop right there because, again, I just wanted to establish again, notice the two kind of reference. One, in Moses' case, the names were written in the book of life. And then those who had sinned, the threat was we're going to be taken out of the book of life. In this case, there were people who were not even written in the book of life. But the other books are those that every person who stands in this judgment, their deeds are recorded. And let me say this. It is only the wicked who are going to have those deeds, in a sense, be a factor in their eternal judgment. Okay? Now, even though the bema seat of Christ, we're going to stand as a judgment, not for condemnation, but for rewards. Okay? And that's going to be interesting because, again, we don't know the depths of either one of this, the details. Again, we just kind of have to wait until we get there to see it. But, again, everyone who stands before this great white throne judgment are there because they have rejected Jesus Christ. And now every work is going to be, they're going to be judged for eternal consequences as a result of their work. All right, we're going to continue with this. Pick it up in verse 13 in the next video. I'll see you then.